Hi, everyone. It's Professor Hall, and today we are talking about Tom Sawyer. So, in our first part, this lecture right now, I'm going to talk about the author, literary movements, a little bit of the background of concepts of childhood that are in the general culture, and then concepts of childhood as it applies to this novel. And then in part two, we get into a little bit more of the historical background, the cultural context. We talk about the structure of the book and some of the social criticism and other major themes. So let's get started. Okay, Mark Twain. Born Samuel Langhorne Clemens on November 30th, 1835 in Missouri. He grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, and in our novel, this is a small town, much like Hannibal, and really kind of supposed to be reflecting that. And the book takes place in the 1840s, when Mark Twain would have been growing up as a young boy. So some of the historical and cultural background are reflecting his childhood. He had a lot of early hardships. His father passed away when he was 11, so he left school after 5th grade, which would not have been completely unusual at that time. You know, we still have child labor practices, and many young men especially would leave school to become apprentices, which is what he did. So he worked as an apprentice typesetter and printer. At one point, he was part of the silver prospecting, the gold rush and the silver rush. He was in the Confederate Army for 2 weeks before he quit. He also worked as a riverboat pilot, an experience that not only enriched his worldview, but also gave birth to this pen name, Mark Twain, which means like Mark twice, meaning 2 fathoms deep. So, like many writers of the time, after some of these more adventurous experiences, as he was settling down, he started a career as a journalist, which at that point often was sort of also like an apprenticeship. We have other people like Walt Whitman, who started their careers in this way, and he would contribute to newspapers. He also had extensive travel, especially later on, to Europe, the Middle East, even Asia, which helped to sort of hone his adventurous tales. He had a wry humor, a keen observation of human nature, is really known for his sarcasm and his wit. Which we can see in many of his stories, including this book. So, Twain's personal life. He married Olivia Langdon in 1870. She came from a wealthier family in New York. He still has a study, and it was moved, I think, not too far to Elmira College. So if you go to Elmira, New York, you can see his study there. I've walked around it. It's quite interesting. I could not find it because I think it's a private photo. I got this one of Twain with a cigar in his mouth and his family and their dog. But there's another one of this dog basically being sad that he's typing or being sad that he's writing and doing his and work. And it just makes me laugh because that's what my dog does too. She bats my hands away when I'm typing. And then she lays on the ground looking at me sad, trying to get me to take her for a walk. So he had sort of this cozy home life for a bit, and then 4 children. Langdon, who unfortunately died in infancy, and then Susie, Clara, and Jean. His wife and his daughters, Susie and Jean, all passed away before he did. Susie, fairly young, of meningitis. Jean had epileptic seizure, and his wife from heart attack, which was actually caused, they think, by tuberculosis. So a lot of problems back then that thankfully we don't have as much now with things like tuberculosis, and although meningitis can be fatal, things like epilepsy is now treated a lot better. At any rate, he lived in Hartford, Connecticut, as well as the place in Elmira, New York that I talked about earlier, and later in Europe, in part due to this financial strain. which we'll talk about in a minute, but he really struggled with finances through a large part of his life. He suffered from depression, but in later years, he continued to write and lecture, in part because he had to. And he loved animals and cigars, as we see in many of the photographs. He had close friendships with scientists and writers, industrialists like Nikola Tesla, and his death came one day after Halley's Comet's closest approach to Earth. And he said, I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It's coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it. And in fact, yeah, he kind of predicted that was going to be the span of his life. So his work and his financial struggles. He had a lot of ambition, but also some really poor investments and some redemption financially through just persistence, the enduring popularity of his persona, and the fact that he was quite a prolific writer. So every time he got into financial straits, he would try to write things to make more money. Now, I've noted only a few of his works here. There are many more, but just to kind of have a brief timeline, the short story that a lot of people read in high school, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, is something that perplexes students sometimes because it is so long and it's really a long joke that just goes on forever. But that was published by the New York Saturday Press, and I think you have to remember, if you do read it, that we have, like, you know, I'm thinking of a comedian right now who said, like, back then you had to come up with slow activities because there's a lot of time on your hands, especially like in the winter months. And that story sort of is a great depiction of like slow activities that people would be involved in. 1869. So we really know Mark Twain, I think, the most from Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But really, he came to fame with this book, Innocents Abroad, which is this tale of Americans who are the innocents going over to Europe, which was really a popular thing to do after the Civil War, that people had not been to Europe, but their families had been to Europe, but they oftentimes their families had come from Europe, I meant to say, and oftentimes they're now several generations removed, and they are really sort of true Americans, having lived here for many generations. They wanted to revisit their European roots. It's a very funny book, especially to people at that time it would have been funny, and it was really a bestseller, so much so that there were comments saying, like, people own two books, the Bible and Innocents Abroad. Roughing It is a sort of semi-autobiographical tale of Twain going out into the wilderness and during the period of the gold rush and the silver mining boom and all of that. And that was sort of a follow-up to Innocents Abroad, which was also well received. So we have a lot of money coming in from this. In 1876, Tom Sawyer was published to great acclaim. But then in the early 1880s, he invested heavily in this typesetting machine, which was basically a failed technology. So we follow up Tom Sawyer with The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which also became a bestseller and is really considered a masterpiece of American literature in particular. Some call it the great American novel. Why are we not reading that instead of Tom Sawyer? The answer is basically two reasons. One, Tom Sawyer really, to me, is more of a children's book. Huckleberry Finn is, I think, more young adult reading. And the second is that I like Tom Sawyer better and I'm teaching it. So I get to pick. In 1884, he founded the Charles L. Webster and Company, which was like a publishing venture so that he could publish his own work and try to kind of keep more money and not give a percentage to the publishers, but that ultimately failed as well. So this leads to declaring bankruptcy, being over $100,000 in debt at that time is like millions of dollars today. Right. So really problematic with just reckless spending and that kind of thing. So At the urging of his wife, he embarks on a global lecture tour and repays some of his debt. That took until 1898. So again, really 4 years of writing and touring pretty much constantly, almost to the point of exhaustion. And thankfully, sort of for the very last part of his life, pulled himself back out of it. But for a while, had to publish a number of books. And I think you kind of see that with like the sequels and follow-up of like Tom Sawyer, Boy Detective, and like things of that nature, where we get into some silliness. But we do have other great works at that time. You know, we've got The Prince and the Pauper is in here, as well as A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, which is another great work. So, Twain's beliefs. There are those who scoff at the schoolboy, calling him frivolous and shallow, yet it was the schoolboy who said, faith is believing what you know ain't so. Very cynical look at spiritual matters. And in fact, I don't have this on the slide, but I want to mention that his wife was a person of faith when he met her. She fell into a Great Depression in part because of some of his beliefs. And they tell you this story if you take a tour of the house and the study and the grave, that and it's in some letters of hers as well, I believe, that basically he said, you know, if you are so sad, then return to your faith. And she basically said, like, living with you, I don't know that I have any faith left, which is sort of really a sad look at how this affected some other people around him. But because not just that he didn't believe or that he didn't have any religion or spirituality, but more of the idea that he was so bitter about that. And really in his books, I think what we see are, as this says, really these complex thoughts where we're having social criticism, and through satire we're revealing some anti-religious sentiments, so that, as I put here, mocking of religious rituals, especially hypocrites who supported slavery in Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. And the question of slavery was extremely important to his beliefs because he was anti-slavery and yet lived in what we would now call kind of a swing state. And I'll get into that more in the second lecture. But Missouri did allow slavery because of where it was located, although there was a lot of debate in the state about whether or not that should happen. So his books, I would say, are still trying to teach children something. And basically he's saying in his books, question religion, especially when it comes in this like rote form where it doesn't mean anything to you, and especially when there are people who are quite hypocritical. You should question these things and try to sort of break free from institutions in a way. And in his books it's a lot, I think, more gentle, especially I'm thinking of the very humorous letters that are written from Eve, I think. Is it Letters from Eve or Letters from Adam and Eve? But it's this satirical fake correspondence between Adam and Eve. And yet I think in his personal life, maybe a bit more biting. And we have a lot more of that in his private writings and his private correspondence. So just some kind of things to think about, you know, that the book still has sort of a moral message, even though it's not this traditional moral message that you would find in some other books of the golden age of children's literature, but certainly the period before it, right? Where everything is moralistic and didactic and all of that kind of thing. His writing style fits in with local color and realism literary movements. We're going to talk about that more in a minute, but basically we're using colloquial language, authentic dialogue, and especially dialect to bring these characters to life. He alternates between formal and informal, suiting the narrative's mood, especially when we have some intrusive narration, which would not be that unusual for books during this time. I really love how he balances these lengthy really descriptive sentences, and then we'll have some short, punchy kind of lines. So this is meant to really mimic natural conversation, and narrative rhythm is enhanced by this type of writing. So I like it a lot more than like, we're going to also, for the class that I'm recording this for at least, we're reading Anne of Green Gables, which I think is a really great companion book to Tom Sawyer. It has some stark differences, but also a lot of similarities. And that book is written in long, flowery passages that some people just love the imagery and some people can't stand it. And then you have something, you know, like by Ernest Hemingway, which is just like short and punchy and to the point, and we take out and kill all of our adjectives and all of our adverbs and things like that. And Twain kind of mixes it up, which is really fun. But yeah, figurative language, metaphors, similes, a little bit of personification here and there, and trying to balance nostalgia with irony and humor. So, and then irony again. And satire to critique social institutions. So in my opinion, and I had a professor of mine debate me on this at one point, who said that his works were not nostalgic, and I was like, no, they are. They're not sentimental though. So we are looking back on the past with fondness, which is what nostalgia is. But we're not dipping into sentimentality, which is an excessive outpouring of emotions about that nostalgic period of time. I know that might be confusing, but I do think that it's an important distinction to make. So yeah, nostalgic, but not sentimental. At least that's how I read them, and you can debate that yourself, I guess. So his legacy and impact. He was known as like the father of American literature, although sometimes that's also given to Washington Irving, so I don't know. But he had a really uniquely American narrative voice. He's really known also as a great humorist. A lot of his speeches and lectures were based in humor, and he has these social critiques, which we'll get into a lot more in depth in the next lecture. But critiquing racism, social hypocrisy, injustice, and this sort of challenges societal norms, and then is still part of discussions, even those that we're having now about race and freedom and morality in America. We've got other major authors who are really influenced by him: William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, who I just mentioned, Toni Morrison, Kurt Vonnegut. All of these talked about Twain as having a real influence on their writing. And Hemingway in particular once said, all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. That's great. I just like Tom Sawyer more. But his books are widely read still, studied around the world, and they do reflect some universal themes about childhood, freedom, morality, human nature. We have adaptations that are in films, in theater, and television. There's anime of Tom Sawyer. There are manga books. There's comic books. And now, especially with his works mostly in the public domain, I think that opens it up to a lot more. I just saw yesterday, actually, while I was doing research, I stumbled upon Thomasina Sawyer, which is Tom Sawyer but gender swapped, so that Tom Sawyer is a girl. And I have not watched that yet, but believe me, I plan to. So, let's talk about some literary movements. The Romantic period is obviously before this book is written, which it was written in the 1870s, but takes place in the 1840s. Romantic period begins around 1800, after the Revolutionary and New Nationalism periods of American literature. So if you're in the class for the Golden Age of children's literature, we are looking at 1865 to 1926. A lot of that movement took place in England, and in those we talk about the Victorian period, the long Victorian period, the Edwardian period, and then the interwar period, which is between World War I and World War II. So in America, we don't mark our literary periods by who's in power. Well, we sort of do, but not in the same way. So the Romantic period was a reaction against the rational, scientific, utilitarian writing of the previous ages. Prior to that was the Puritan writing of the 1700s as well, or the 1600s as well. So writers became, in the Romantic period, really concerned with expressing emotion. They explored nature and the darkest and noblest sides of humanity. They used symbolism to represent strong, forceful, natural emotions. And the music and art also reflects this, which in a really interesting way. So some examples are Washington Irving, who I talked about before, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, right, and the danger there. James Fenimore Cooper with The Last of the Mohicans, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Walt Whitman, Edgar Allan Poe. All of these are in this time period of literature. Then we also have Transcendentalism. There we go. So the Transcendentalists believe man is inherently good, divinity pervading through all nature and humanity. So God is not just in a church, but you can see God in the world. Every man has a divine spark which can be encouraged or dampened. Institutions such as religion and government corrupt the individual. That is a really pervasive notion that is still in Twain's work. So Twain is sort of, as a realist and local color author, reacting against a lot of the Romantic traditions where there's high sentimentality, strong emotions. The Gothic is in there as well. And on the other end, this belief that all men are inherently good, which he does not believe, but he does think that institutions corrupt the individual. So it's interesting, sort of, what he takes from them and what he rejects. But members also, which Twain would be interested in, held really progressive views of feminism, abolition, and communal living, because if you have a divine spark that can be encouraged or dampened, then we should not have slaves, because every person has this divine spark within them, and slavery dampens it and puts it out. We should allow women to have more rights and to be able to vote, because women also have this divine spark within them. So I think some of these more progressive political views are also things that Twain would have embraced. So some examples of this are Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, a little bit later, Louisa May Alcott, writing Little Women, also during the golden age of children's literature, but really in keeping with the transcendentalism that was pervasive in her family, and then other figures like Margaret Fuller. So the only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be. Ralph Waldo Emerson. You can take whatever path you want, and you can, be outside and in nature and encourage your divine spark in that way. So what happens after this, and to a certain extent, I guess, during, because Louisa May Alcott's writing after, but I think she's really sort of in an earlier literary tradition in many ways. But at any rate, the Civil War takes place from 1861 to 1865. We have a loss of life of 620,000 to 750,000 men losing their lives. 60% of those deaths, they believe, were from disease. So leading up to that point, abolitionist work was published, and again, this fit in with the transcendental ideas for reform. But in terms of literature, we have a little bit of a gap. A lot of American literature is, if you've taken a generic American lit class, it's usually beginnings to 1860 or 1865, and then 1860 or 1865 to present. A lot of times it's split up in these ways. During this time, really, personal slave narratives, autobiographies, things like 12 Years a Slave, Up from Slavery, Frederick Douglass, people of that nature, really had a great impact. And we get these stories of hardship and enslavement and from a very personal perspective, which would then kind of carry over as a real demarcation of both of these literary traditions. So you have some sentimentality as they try to get emotion from their readers so that their readers will enact social change, and yet we also have a lot of the realist elements, which we'll get into in a moment, and a brutality as they tried to explain and describe their very specific experiences. So the break from realism to realism is essentially that the actual horrors of war sort of really contrast with romantic ideals and the high-minded transcendentalists, and then the supernatural horrors dreamed up by Gothic writers of that time. So we have, paintings like this of the Hudson Valley tradition being kind of representative of transcendentalism, and then the actual horrors of war. Some writers describe their experiences in war. There's this rise in systematizing the study and documenting of history, and after the Civil War, so we have these like ethnographers going to different places and trying to document history. And there's this real increase in the interest of unique groups of people living in various places of the United States. So what is this, now that we have been split and then reunited, what are people really like out in the Old West, or the frontier rather? What are people really like in Maine? What are people like in high New York society? What are people like in Missouri? Realist writers are working with fiction and poetry, but their work is based on real people, real characters, real events, things they saw and experienced in everyday life. And this is the tradition which Twain really belongs to. So we render reality closely and in comprehensive detail. There's an emphasis on verisimilitude, even at the expense of plot. There are some stories from this period. Oh, that's the famous fence incident. But there are some stories from this period that a lot of my students, and even myself sometimes, just find quite dull. And that's because character is more important than action and plot. Characters are complex and realistic. They have complex ethical choices, and the plot is usually something that could happen. So there's no sensationalism. There's no emotionally driven dramatic elements or of the, former romantic time. Symbolism is less important and sometimes completely absent. Now, if you hate symbolism, you're going to like this book, I guess, because there are some symbols, but it doesn't mean as much as it did to the Romantics. And then we have regionalism and local color that are kind of offshoots or sometimes thought of as like sub-genres within this larger umbrella of realism. Regionalism is where writers are wanting to portray unique characters from each region in the U.S., as I described before. So characters from Massachusetts have different interests and quirks and mannerisms than characters in Wyoming or gold rush prospectors in California, which you can read like Edith Wharton versus Bret Harte, right? They're talking about two totally different societies, although Wharton is a little bit later. But then we also have local color writing, again, emphasizing detailed, colorful descriptions of settings and customs, having this vivid sense of place. We have dialect, which Twain is known for, quirky characters at the center of stories, but also the setting is like a character in and of itself. So we're combining realistic detail and sometimes a little bit of charm and nostalgia for this simpler or more authentic life. It's sometimes criticized for that reason, like we're idealizing or we're stereotyping various local cultures. But I love about these stories is that they are like little snapshots. You have after World War I, when this period of literature ends and we get into modernism, you have kind of a homogenization of a lot of culture because of inventions, things like the radio, where people in California and people in Wyoming, maybe, and people in Massachusetts can all listen to the same radio program. And certainly after World War II, especially with the TV and all of that, you have a lot less unique little pockets of the United States. After World War II and into the 1980s and 90s, you get kind of this like rubber stamping of different towns where you have like, you know, a Walmart in every town, a McDonald's in every town, at a certain point in time, an Applebee's in every town, a Blockbuster at around that time, a mall and a little strip mall, like those kind of things. A lot of suburban towns kind of started to look the same. So I love this period of literature because I want to know more about like this guy and his donkey. Right? I want to know who he is, and I want to know how he talks, and I want to know what adventures he's having. And then I want to be able to dip into higher society in a totally different region and find out what their customs are and all of their little social cues of like, oh, somebody dropped their fan and that might be like important and that might mean something. And she wore gloves, but she didn't. And her dress line was, 2 inches too low. I want to know all of that. As a lover of history, I'm like so intensely interested in people and their local customs. So all of this also lends itself. I love this thing of Mark Twain with 2 of his children. Lends itself into how we understand Mark Twain's concepts of childhood, because we are coming out of the Romantic period, is far behind us, and now we're in realism, and we are looking at how this aligns with other writers of the golden age of children's literature, which if you're not in that class, or this is for a different class, this was from 1865 to 1926. This era emphasized innocence, imagination, adventure, and you can think about like Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan on the British side of things. Twain's work does have some innocence, in some sense, a little bit of nostalgia for simpler times, but there's no moralizing or sentimentality of books like Little Women, as I mentioned before, which sort of belongs to the transcendentalist tradition, even though it's during the realist period, or Anne of Green Gables, which is from Canada, but again, in my opinion, a lot more sentimental and a lot more room for Anne to learn lessons and become a better, more mature young woman from book's beginning to book's end, right? But it's also in keeping with other realism and local color authors where we have these realistic characters. So yes, we have a look back at a past time that's much like his childhood, but we also have mischievous, imperfect little children where there is no call like there is in Little Women and Anne of Green Gables. There we have little girls who are quite naughty at times, but they're encouraged not to be so. Here we have really reveling in Tom's adventures where he is sewing his collar to make it look like he did not go swimming. And there's nothing in there to say, he shouldn't have done that, or he shouldn't have skipped school, or he should have stayed away from the swimming hole. There's nothing like that in there. There's just a joy and delight at these lies, basically. Tom and Huck are really embodying free-spirited, rebellious nature. They're not obedient. They resist authority. They seek independence. And because of that, children are sort of these voices for social criticism as well. They're questioning race, class, hypocrisy, adult institutions, especially things like school and church. And I think for that reason, the characters in these books are enduring and they are quite interesting, because who hasn't known a little scampish child like Tom Sawyer? Who hasn't known a child that's maybe a little bit more of a social outcast, but lovable nonetheless, like Huckleberry Finn? And that is where we'll leave off. And then next time we'll talk more about the structure and some of the themes. Thanks, everyone.